Today we're adding integers. We're going to start off with two vocabulary. Opposites are two numbers that are the same distance from zero, but they're on opposite sides of zero on a number line. An example of two opposites would be -3 and 3. The additive inverse is just another term for opposite. They're synonyms. They mean the same thing. When you add an integer and its additive inverse, you always get 0 as your answer. So -3 and 3, these opposites, will add up to 0. We get this term additive inverse because you're actually adding the inverse of this first number, and that's how you arrive at 0. So opposites and additive inverse, two terms that mean the same thing. So let's start by adding integers with the same sign. If we're adding integers and we have two positives or two negatives, the same sign, all we want to do is add the absolute value of those integers. Just ignore the sign completely. Then use that common sign with your answer. So if I'm adding -2 and -4, I'm going to ignore the negatives completely. I notice they're the same sign, then I ignore them. 2 plus 4 is 6. Now, since they were both negative, I'm going to use that common sign with my answer. So my answer will be -6. I can use the number line to check my answer. So this problem starts at -2. That's where I'm going to start on my number line. And I'm being asked to add -4. So I'm going to move 4 in the negative direction, which is to the left here. And I end up at -6. So I've checked my answer. It's correct. If I'm adding integers with different signs, I'm actually going to subtract the absolute values. I'll take that larger number and subtract the smaller to get my part of my answer, the number part of my answer. Then I'm going to use the sign of the integer with the greater absolute value for my answer. So if I'm doing a problem like this, where I've got two integers with different signs, I'm actually going to subtract them. I'm ignoring the signs. I'm just doing 10 minus 5, which gives me 5. Then I'm going to look back at which one had a greater absolute value. Well, the absolute value of 5 is 5, and the absolute value of -10 is 10. So this one has a greater absolute value, which means there's more negatives in this problem, so my answer should be negative. In this problem, I'm adding -3 and 7. Since they have different signs, I'm actually going to subtract their absolute values. 7 minus 3 gives me 4. I look back to see which of the numbers in my problem had a greater absolute value. It was 7, and since 7 is positive, there's more positives. I have a positive answer here. Now, the additive inverse property says that if I'm adding an integer and its additive inverse, its opposite, the answer will always be 0. So as soon as I notice that two numbers are opposites or each other's additive inverse, I know my answer is going to be 0. Let's take a look at a problem where we're being asked to add more than two integers. So here we have a list of 4 bank account transactions, and we want to find the change in the account balance. So we have 4 numbers here to add up. So they withdrew, they took out $40, so -40. Then they deposited $50. They also deposited $75. That means they're putting money into their account. And then at the end of the month, they took out $50 again, so -50. I'm going to put some parentheses around this one because I don't want anyone to think that's a subtraction sign. Don't really need it here because I wouldn't start a problem with a subtraction sign, so I know that one's negative, but this one might be confusing, so I'm just going to add my parentheses. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add these two numbers. So -40 plus 50, different signs, so I subtract them and I get 10, and more positives, so positive 10. I'm going to bring down the rest of my equation. Now I'm going to add these two, 10 and 75, same sign, gives me positive 85. And finally here at the end, I'm adding 85 and negative 50, different signs, so I'm actually subtracting them to get 35. And 85 has a greater absolute value, so more positives. So at the end of the month, they have $35.